In this episode of 5 Minutes of Cloud, we're going to look at the qualities that make up an infrastructure as a service offering, whether it be a private cloud or a public cloud service. We're looking at the basic core components. So one of the key things that makes an infrastructure as a service offering are the core components that enable that service. We're talking about the bare bones resources, things like the components that make up a data center, compute services, network services, and storage services. Mapping these together with a piece of middleware of some nature that actually enables on-demand access. Now, in some of the better services, you would get on-demand via API-driven interfaces. So this would be something that you could actually integrate into an automation framework. But that's not actually a requirement for infrastructure as a service. As long as we have an on-demand interface, potentially a web service interface, a web interface of some nature, or even a client application that actually enables these technologies and capabilities, would enable infrastructure as a service. In addition to those core components, having compute access of some nature, virtual or physical, having network services, again, virtual overlay network type technologies like SDN, or the physical resources of the actual wires in the data center. And the same is true for storage, whether it be block storage or object storage or something that's ephemeral. In addition to that core capability, we also need services that support the value add accelerators effectively for our data center. And that's things like image management. So if I want to turn a computer on, having a way to actually import and manage an image of that compute system, whether it be a full disk image for a root operating system, for example, or maybe something as lightweight as a container, is a very powerful component. In addition, we find that network services, things beyond just that bare network connectivity, that layer 2 ability for two virtual machines to talk to each other, or IP address allocation and management, these are services that are also important. And lastly, additional storage, not just the storage for running our operating system, potentially things like the object storage systems that have become very popular in web services these days, the tools that people are using and embedding into their applications, effectively leveraging platform-like capabilities that expand what that infrastructure provides. Now, one of the key capabilities that becomes very important in infrastructure service offerings, though, is the API interfaces. As I said earlier, you do not need to have APIs to enable an infrastructure as a service offering, but they certainly make it a lot easier to leverage. Often tools like an OpenStack environment, for example, have both a web interface for managing and manipulating many of the infrastructure components, and they have application programmatical interfaces, APIs, available to them to actually enable and leverage these services. So that gives us the ability to now talk to our infrastructure service, again, whether it's web interface or APIs, but we also need to actually be able to automate some of the services after the fact. Again, this is effectively part of the acceleration process. What other tools can we enable in this infrastructure service that would make it easier to deploy an application? In the cloud space, the generic cloud space, again, this is effectively led by the Amazon Web Services-like environments. In the cloud space, one of the key tools is a tool called Cloud Init. Well, Cloud Init is a very powerful language for providing some basic update and setup information that can be passed between services. That's the infrastructure automated on usually virtual platforms model, but there are other tools that could actually also pass in that base level operating system management information as a part of an infrastructure service offering. In addition to that, in the network space, one of the key components above and beyond that core network services domain is the ability to manage IP addresses. We're still using a lot of services that are based on IPv4 addresses. There are still a lot of addresses available. There are no open spare pools of addresses, but there's still a lot of addresses available. Managing those address resources is a real core component of enabling the service, the flexibility, the scale up, scale down elasticity of the service. And often with those IP address management components becomes the key need to support network address translation. So translating from one of these now limited resource IPv4 addresses to an internal IPv4 address space, that network address translation comes across as the floating IP model in most cloud systems that we see today. Not a requirement, but again, a value add feature that makes an infrastructure as a service easier to leverage. We can also look at the disk side of things. At its base simplest model, right, an infrastructure as a service needs to provide core storage, at least for our operating system or our operating system container, application container type systems model. Well, we can extend that by providing some additional capabilities. One of the more important ones in the infrastructure space, and it's interesting because it's something that the application users are using very heavily, things like web services that provide video, streaming of that video from an object storage subsystem. Object storage is something that's not necessarily a generic data center service these days. Maybe it's becoming one. But the object storage services are also becoming a core infrastructure service, something that you can use as a backup target, for example, to write into an object store as your backup for many of your services. So having these additional components, again, the bare metal compute, network and storage components, and then the additional services on top, things like object storage in the storage space, IP address management, and potentially network services like network address translation as part of the floating IP model in the network space, and things like the cloud init tool set for automating some of the initial bring up of virtual machines in the compute space. All of these are components that are accelerators on top of the core infrastructure services of enabling compute, network, and storage functions, basic data center class functions in an automated fashion. And the automation is either enabled through some form of a portal, a web services interface most likely, or also hopefully an API-driven interface as well. So these are the core components that make up infrastructure as a service. Thanks for watching. This was Robert Starmer bringing you 5 Minutes of Cloud. 5 Minutes of Cloud is brought to you by Kumulus Technologies, the company I actually work for, and we really appreciate the fact that you actually attended and watched this little segment. We obviously have a YouTube channel here, so please subscribe to that. We have Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. Yeah, I do actually find some interesting things to say on Twitter once in a while. And on top of that, we have a mailing list. If you subscribe to the mailing list, we have a free report, basically 5 pitfalls of cloud that you can avoid if you get my report. So why don't you hop on over to our website, sign up for the mailing list. You'll get that report delivered to your inbox shortly after signing up. And I think that's also another very interesting and important read. Thanks so much again for watching.